Dream machine. .com, H07, I-18 in the snap. We're building the future, never looking back.
Have you ever chatted with a large language model and wondered how confident should I be in this response? Or when it shows you its line of reasoning, have you ever asked yourself how much trust can we really put in what it's saying? Now imagine that same large language model being used in clinical practice. What's at stake when we rely on these tools for patient care? In this episode of Imaging Informatics Unplugged, I sit down with Dr. Woojin Kim, Chief Strategy Officer and CMIO at HOPPR, Chief Medical Officer at the ACR Data Science Institute, and an MSK Rad at the Palo Alto VA Medical Center. Woojin is a serial entrepreneur, having co-founded Montage Healthcare Solutions and Equium Intelligence that were both acquired by major players in the imaging AI space. In this conversation, we dive into the hype, the reality, and what's next for AI in radiology, covering silent degradation, continuous monitoring, context engineering, fairness and bias, and how multimodal and agentic AI could reshape the next decade of imaging. So don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if this is a shameless plug here, if you're interested in topics like imaging informatics, AI, enterprise imaging workflows, check out our courses at learn.nagelsconsulting.com. And with all that said,
welcome to Informatics Unplugged, and we have Dr. Woojin Kim here today, and I'm really excited about this conversation. And thank you very much, Woojin, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, what kicked this off was months ago. You had posted something on LinkedIn. You were playing around with Notebook LM, and I had actually done some playing around with Notebook LM as part of my duties with Simcast, and put together a bunch of the enterprise imaging white papers, and I was very impressed with the end result. And so I wanted to chat with you about how it's going with Notebook LM and your opportunity of kind of playing around with that, and where you think this is going to be going. So these tools are becoming really well known, and they have made a lot more accessible to get education and content in maybe a better way. So when we think of imaging and education in imaging or radiology, where do you think these types of tools fit in, or do you think that human touch is still going to be essential as we move forward?
Yeah, no, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. People do often ask me about, how I use AI and what tools I use. And I can tell you, Notebook LM is one of my absolute favorite applications. In fact, I use it every day. I spend about 4 to 6 hours every day reading and learning about AI. And I know that I am very fortunate and I'm grateful to, have been in companies that give me the freedom to do this. Well, it's not easy to read straight for that long. So I often use Notebook LM to review a lot of papers. And whenever I get a, PDF of an academic paper, for example, I would throw that into Notebook LM and create an audio overview. And by the way, you probably noticed nowadays, recently, you can now create, video overviews as well. And I listen to it as I'm walking on a treadmill or, because I travel so often when I'm waiting for the plane to take off. I would download a whole bunch of them. And if I really like the paper or want to find out more, I start reading it. And for certain topics like, say, Agentic AI, I create a separate notebook where I would store all the interesting and relevant articles, blog posts, and YouTube videos. So you can tell that I absolutely love this tool. Having said that, they're more like really good study aids than actual teachers. Like other fields in medicine, radiology isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about, developing that clinical intuition to know when something looks kind of off in an image. And tools like Notebook LM can definitely, quiz you and help you review differentials, but it can't watch you read and look at an image and tell you, hey, you're missing this sort of finding. So I see these tools as incredibly valuable supplements that can free up, human educators to focus on the really complex, nuanced stuff that requires that human touch. You can't learn radiology by just reading TLDRs. And that's why, when I was an academic radiologist many, many years ago, I used to tell my residents and fellows all the time to actually read textbooks instead of reading only those, guides with short bullet points.
Interesting. Yeah, I found actually there was a long verbose webinar that I had to watch, and it was for something I was doing with IHE. And I threw it into Notebook LM. I went to my daughter's dance class and I listened to it and it's incredible. There's obviously, like you said, there's limitations, but it's a pretty amazing tool. I have to ask you though, you said so every day you try to consume about 4 to 6 hours worth of AI content. How do you go about cutting through the wheat for the chaff and making sure that you're getting substantive content that's meaningful for what you're looking to improve on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do have a system because I think you do need to have a system to be able to go through a ton of articles. I haven't done an actual count, but I think I do go through about 200 or so articles and posts and things like that in a given day. But as you can imagine, I'm not obviously reading all those articles, word by word, cover to cover. And so what I do is I actually use something called a reader from Readwise. And it's just a single application. I don't have any, financial ties to that company, but it's just a single application that collects all the blog posts, all the articles, everything I read. So if I get a newsletter through my email account, I have it set up so that it just automatically sends it to that application. So every morning, afternoon, and evening, I would set aside time, block that time that I can focus and read these things. And I just go to Reader and I just go through, cases. And, I've read through so many of these now that sometimes I can just read just the title and I was no, I'm not interested in that. And then if I'm interested in, I might just take the Reader also has this really nice, a little summary feature so that you can kind of take a quick glance of what is this article or blog post is about. And if I'm interested, then I would actually read it. And a lot of times I actually have the audio version turned on so that it would actually read it to me as I am reading. So I'm actually reading and listening to the text at the same time. And that helps me, focus a little bit more. And so I go through those articles really, really quickly that way. So I do have that. And then recently, I started using something called Recall. And so if I look at a website and I wanted to kind of save it, the nice thing about that particular one is, I would just click a button, it will save it. But I can actually ask questions right there and then. What's the TLDR? What are the key takeaways? So a lot of times when I'm watching YouTube podcasts or, YouTube lectures, sometimes you just want to what is, you see the clickbait title, right? But I don't want to watch the whole 20-minute, 30-minute just to get the answer to that clickbait title. So I would just literally, just ask that question. And, what are the 5 key takeaways? What are some interesting quotes? And so then, if it's interesting, I would read the whole, I'll watch the whole thing. But it really helps me to organize these things in a systematic way instead of going through emails for this source and then going to this journal for this. Instead of that, having that a single point of contact where I can collect everything in a single place. And then so I can just go through really, really quickly. So I do use that system. And that's really the only way I can go through that many articles and posts in a given day.
I won't belabor this point too much, but I'm curious as well. So of that 4 to 6 hours, how much is, you wake up, your mind is a bit more fresh in the morning. Do you cover a lot of those hours in the morning or do you spread it across throughout the day?
I do spread it across through that day because I do have a, actual job, right? So they do tell you you really want to save that morning hour, those morning crucial, precious morning hours to do something that you definitely want to accomplish for that day, right? And yes, reading those articles is something that I definitely want to do because, I don't want to wake up the next day with, 400 articles to read, right? And so I do spend a good chunk of time in the morning dedicated, focusing on it. But I also have, another 2 hours in the afternoon, and then I might spend another 2 hours in the evening before I go to bed to just, catch up on the last minutes sort of thing. So I do spread them apart. I don't read 6 hours straight. That would be pretty difficult, even for me. But
that would be quite a marathon. Yeah.
Yeah, but I enjoy it. I love learning about this thing. And, about AI nowadays, I've never seen anything move this fast. And it's fun and it's exciting. It's scary at the same time, but at the same time, a lot of thing about AI, when people ask me oh, how should I learn about AI? Even though I talk a lot about reading, the thing that I recommend a lot of folks is, hey, you know what? There are a lot of AI tools out there and you got to play with them. You got to get your hands dirty. You can't just read about a certain tool. when you actually use it, whether it's a chatbot or, AI coding tool or vibe coding tool, whatever it is, just give it a try, play with it, test it. Because when you do that, then you get a sense like not only the capabilities, but also the limitations. So you really have a better understanding. And then that also helps you kind of weed through what you said earlier, all the hype. Believe me, there's a ton of hype out there. But when you start playing with this thing, then you realize like, I don't know, that's a little bit overhyped. These are the limitations. So that's one thing I recommend. So I do also, spend time, picking a tool and then, start, tweaking it, playing with it, just to get a better sense.
So you mentioned a good point, because this is a very exciting time that we live in. Their back propagation is from the 70s, but it was chalk on a chalkboard and it was theoretical and the compute power wasn't there. And now it's amazing that we're living in this time where we're seeing these algorithms that are now the compute has caught up, and we're seeing this in practice. AlexNet was 2012, which is hard to believe where we are today. And so there's not a shortage of people that are trying to dip their toes into an opportunity for clinical imaging and AI workflows or AI tools. And so I was curious if you could share with us, what's the one area that you tend to see people that they underestimate the risks when they want to bring AI into clinical imaging?
Sure. I think there are a lot of things, people can talk about. But personally, I find, what I would call a silent degradation problem with AI in clinical imaging to be particularly concerning. So what do I mean by this? Imagine, you've done the right thing and locally evaluated the AI model that's been FDA clear on your own data. You've done the right thing. And after evaluating, you deploy that AI system that's working beautifully. But then the hospital upgrades its CT scanner, or, patient demographics shift slightly, or someone changes a protocol, and the AI starts failing bit by bit without anyone noticing. And the radiologists don't realize it because they're getting used to trusting the AI suggestion because, it works so well at the beginning. And the system isn't throwing any error messages, and there's no monitoring in place to catch these, gradual decline. Like, it's almost like having a smoke detector that slowly stops working but never beeps to tell you that the battery is dying. And those beeps are super loud, right? And in fact, apparently they're doing a smoke alarm test in my building today. We might get interrupted by that. But, by the time you realize there's a problem, well, real harm has already been done. And unfortunately, this threat of degradation of AI model performance over time is underestimated because I think the existing paradigms for evaluation, regulation, and governance are overwhelmingly focused on pre-deployment accuracy, creating this false sense of security about an AI's performance once it's released to the wild. And this is why continuous monitoring is so important. And notice how I use the term continuous. And I know some people have, advocated for like periodic monitoring, but the reality is you have absolutely no idea how gradual or sudden these performance degradations happen. Also, I know many folks use the term model drift. You hear that term a lot, but I want to clarify that, oftentimes, especially with computer vision models, it's not the model that's drifting, it's the model's performance and other surrounding factors like data or concept. But my concern isn't just this. You have to look at it more systematically, meaning the silent degradation problem that I've been talking about is due to a combination of a lot of things like AI model grittiness, the messy reality of clinical practice, and human cognitive biases, such as automation bias. So it's not just one thing. But, focusing back on the importance of continuous monitoring, this is why initiatives like the ACR's Assess AI, which is a quality registry that tracks the performance of radiology AI solutions, are so crucial. And I'll guarantee you that you will see greater emphasis placed on the continuous monitoring, the post-deployment surveillance aspect of AI clinical usage in the future. So that's what I would say, some of the things that people tend to underestimate.
It's funny that you mentioned trust. I'm curious, it almost circles back to the first comment about notebook LM. And as we're using these as study tools, and that crutch can get really helpful at times, I'm curious if you think there's a risk where the cognitive muscle that we use to, do different types of mental tasks, are going to diminish a little bit because now we have this crutch. It's very common for people our age that we can't do mental math maybe as our parents did, just because we had calculators in the room. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that crutch and if there's concerns about that or where you sit with that.
Yeah, no, and I know that, one of my LinkedIn posts, spurred on this, conversation. But this is another topic that I actually talked about in one of my recent LinkedIn posts, after reading a post by Ethan Mollick, who's a well-known person within the AI sphere. And I started the LinkedIn post with one of his quotes from his post, which was think first, write first, meet first. And I think that's a good way to approach this issue. In that post, I said, his post is worth paying attention to because it addresses one of the most pressing questions about AI's impact on human thinking, to your question. Now, in his post, he discusses, how we can use AI in a productive rather than destructive way. So to your question, what about radiology? Well, even in radiology, I would say the research shows it's really not a simple yes or no answer. It really depends on how we implement these tools. On one hand, we've seen plenty of research on automation bias and how the use of AI can lead to over-reliance and descaling, which is another very important topic. But there is also research that shows when AI is designed thoughtfully as more of a cognitive assistant rather than a decision maker, radiologists do spend more time thinking through cases, not less. So believe me, I use AI tools all the time, as you could tell, and I use a lot of tools, not just ChatGPT. And so I do think about the potential negative impact this may have, especially, for me as well. And, my ability to think critically. In fact, that Mullick post was spurred on by a viral paper titled Your Brain on ChatGPT. And if you're old enough, you know what that's referencing. And I think the key is to really create human AI symbiosis where, the AI handles the routine, repetitive stuff, stuff that I didn't go to medical school for or that, years of residency and fellowship for. Really freeing up, radiologists to focus on the complex reasoning, creativity, and, real world wisdom. Instead of making us lazy and dependent, try to design the human AI system to enhance our thinking. And that's, I think, one of the challenges when it comes to developing AI solutions. And the practical advice that Mollick gives is think first, write first, meet first. And then personally, I think that's something that where I personally think that when I look at the AI solutions is something that you have to really think about. So for example, like this morning, speaking of reading a bunch of, articles and posts, I haven't read through the whole thing yet, but like I got a glimpse and it was about how, the AI solutions that are being used to detect polyps in colonoscopy are getting so good. And yet when they did a little experiment where they decided to take away the little green boxes where, the AI say, hey, there's a polyp, it showed that these GI folks skill went down. Their ability to detect polyps went down, a decrease. So there was a component of de-skilling that was happening. And so I think that's sort of like a warning to us that, hey, you know what? As these AI solutions get really, really good, we really have to think about that human AI symbiosis because otherwise we will run into de-skilling, especially for the younger generation that are training. And so when I use AI, for example, in my radiology practice, I think that's why I like to use my AI solutions in radiology as a safety net, meaning that like, I like to look at the image first and I like to figure out like, what is it? And then, if the AI says, hey, you sure there's something here? And a lot of times I've noticed there are a lot of false positives, but, there are also some, good calls, right? For me to like really look at it again. So I think as a safety net, I think that's why a lot of people tend to use it, even despite the fact that a lot of these AI solutions in radiology tend to generate lots of false positives. But I think that's one way we can use this. But this whole issue of, upskilling versus descaling, I think something that we really have to think carefully about. Great question.
It's funny because I feel like people's ability to even just compose an email has gone down. I've never seen more emails with the M dash in them in the past few months. So, and I find that, like that's an example where I previously loved using the M dash and now I will do everything in my power not to use it just because I don't want to look like AI is writing my copy.
Since you mentioned it, I'm just like you. I actually like using M dashes, and I used it long before ChatGPT. And there's a part of me that refused to say, like, I'm not gonna just stop using it just because people think, oh, we can use ChatGPT for it. But I did notice, yes, the ChatGPT tend to overuse M dashes. But, obviously there are uses for it. So yeah, I don't tend to actually physically go and start deleting M dashes after the fact, just because like, I don't want to look like, ChatGPT wrote it. But it is an interesting thing to watch. Yes.
So when we talk about prompt engineering or even context engineering, where do you see this fitting in the context of integrating AI tools into the PACS, the risks, or whatnot?
Yeah, that's a great question. It seems like you're following me on LinkedIn because this is another thing that I
I
posted
am, yes.
on LinkedIn. And you're right. In the world of AI, a new term is gaining traction, and that's context engineering term you mentioned. So I think it will be beneficial to first talk about what context engineering is and how it differs from prompt engineering that people are now, familiar with. And so what I would say is, if prompt engineering is like saying Smale Coastal Drive through Portugal, context engineering is orchestrating the entire journey. It would load up your saved list of favorite wines. And let's say you decide to drive an EV. So it, access the live EV charger maps, real-time weather detours, and boutique, stay option space to your preferred driving stretches. That way, the model can craft the perfect itinerary, not something generic out of the LLM, despite the prompt engineering. And it's about really designing the entire AI environment to optimize for success. And this means, giving the AI the right information, the tools, and memory at the right times. So the question is, why now, right? And in a world of AI agents, another term, buzz term that's become extremely popular this year, where you have multi-step reasoning and tool use by these agents, context isn't optional any longer. As the AI landscape evolves, it's becoming pretty clear that the most successful and reliable AI applications won't depend solely on clever prompts. Instead, they'll be built on a strong foundation of well-designed context. So speaking of medical imaging, that means, creating this whole intelligent ecosystem around the AI that knows more, whether that's the patient's history, prior exams and reports, what the radiologist typically looks for, department protocols, even what time of day it is and how busy they are. When we're talking PACS and risks integration, to your point, this means the AI isn't just looking at one exam in isolation anymore. It's dynamically pulling together, the current study, comparing it to previous imaging, grabbing relevant clinical notes from the EMR, and incorporating the specific workflow of that particular radiology department. It's like the AI becomes this contextually aware assistant. And I often say in my talks that the poor clinical AI that we're seeing, unfortunately, is largely related to clinical utility or lack thereof. You see, an AI model has to be clinically useful. If it's not, no one's going to use it. So for example, as a radiologist, I always look at the prior images and reports when they're available. That's why, these narrow AI solutions that do one thing and without any context are of much less use to me. And this is why context engineering in radiology is important. Now, fortunately, I do think we will see this really soon in radiology. And it's not just, some academic concept. For example, at this year's SIM Hackathon, HOPPR's team, specifically John Paulette and Faris Siddiqui from the team, won first place by showcasing how you can use AI agents in radiology that leverage MCPs or model context protocols to provide that extra context that I was talking about.
Yeah, I remember at SIM, there were a few people that were coming up to me and very excited about seeing MCPs in action. Very exciting. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about LLMs, and we'll keep this up. And let's talk about where we've all seen kind of useless imaging histories where it says something like pain or check line. Where do you think, or is there a role that LLMs could in helping reliably improve this in any type of way? What are your thoughts?
Vague or useless clinical histories have been a source of constant complaint by the radiologists long as, I can remember, right? And I've been practicing radiology for almost 20 years now, and I can tell you it's still a problem. And there are several research papers that have shown that we do have the technology to improve this. For example, Dr. Rajesh Bayana and his colleagues published in Radiology recently how large language models, or LLMs, generate clinical histories that are dramatically better instead of, like you said, pain. Or when I was a resident, I would get histories from the ER, room 27, and that was the only history. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this history? Still, there are some pretty significant hurdles to overcome before this becomes routine. One of the biggest concerns is that, as you know, LLMs hallucinate or confabulate, meaning that they make stuff up and they do so with a very confident tone. Plus, there's all this complexity around, integrating these tools in existing hospital systems, getting regulatory authorizations. And honestly, let's face it, many radiologists are still pretty skeptical about letting AI take over parts of any of their, parts of their workflow. So while the promise is definitely there, and I've seen it, and the technology is getting better and better, we're likely looking at a more gradual rollout.
Interesting. Yeah, I was just thinking of how many R's are there in strawberry? And it sounds so confident when it's telling you that there's 2 R's in the word strawberry. So let's talk a little bit more around when we have, maybe there's useless or kind of like vague information, but then there's also the idea of having stuff that is unstructured. And so where do you, there is a lot of variation or prose that can go into a radiology report. Where do you see the usefulness in structuring the data for the purpose of helping an LLM out? Or do you think that, that concept of structuring report data is not as important as we have these tools at our disposal now?
No, I think that's one of the great use cases when it comes to LLMs. For example, when I give talks on generative AI or LLM use cases in radiology, I tend to break them down by looking at the lifecycle radiology reports. And I do that because if I can definitely give you a table of, 30 possible use cases, but no one's going to remember that when they walk out of that talk. And yet, as radiologists, I, reference against radiology reports because for me, that's my primary product, right? And I usually describe it in terms of, how LLMs can benefit before, during, and after report generation. And to the use case that you mentioned, structuring this information is one of the use cases that can happen during the report generation process. And I do that by referencing the structured report templates. Structured reporting is something that, radiology community has been trying to push for many, many years, right? Especially if you look at academic papers, a lot of people say, hey, this is what the patients want. That's what they prefer. That's what clinicians, the referring providers prefer, not your long, multi-paragraph essays. And yet the adoption has been low. And I think there are many, many reasons for it. One of them is that I like to describe is that structured reporting, even though the template is a good idea from an organization perspective, it really takes the radiologist's eyes off the images because they have to look at the image and they got to remember where in the structure field that particular finding needs to go. Sure, if you made it and you have these, little voice, prompts and all these little tricks, you can try to keep your eyes on the images as much as possible. But I just finished my fellowship. I joined a new practice and my boss wants me to use this, particular structure report template. I'm not used to it. Guess what? I'm just going back and forth constantly like this. And I used to joke around. That's probably why many of us, if you get an MRI of cervical spine of, radiologists my age, I bet all of us have degenerative changes, partially, right? Because of that. And also that reduces the adoption level. It changes my visual search pattern because now I'm forced to use my boss's visual search pattern because I need to go through that. Otherwise, I'm jumping all over the place. And then that forces me, then I have to go back and forth. And the beauty of the LLMs is that I can keep my eyes on the images the entire time. It's like having a transcriptionist or a scribe sitting next to you. And I just go through the visual search pattern of my choice, whether I like to go from top to bottom or bottom to top or by organs, whatever it is. I go through it because that's what I was trained on. That's what I feel comfortable. And that's how I know mentally that I'm looking at these images the correct way, at least to me. And then once I'm done, I look over, the LLM has collected all that information and then decided okay, that sentence goes here, this phrase goes over here. And that's where, this whole structuring, the benefits of LLMs have real, use case. And you are already seeing this, right? From a commercial perspective, we launched this when I first joined at Red AI and, as their CMIO, and we came up with the reporting solution, and we came up with this, Gen AI reporting solution. And then everybody they were super excited about it. Case in point, a year later, I think there were like literally a dozen companies doing the same thing, right? And so that tells me like, oh yeah, there's a product market fit. People see the value in this. So that's a long way of answering your question. Like, yeah, is there a benefit? Yeah, I do think so. The other benefit that, that radiologists themselves might not realize is that the LLMs also have the ability to really structure it in a truly structured format, right? And one of the things that people say when they talk about structured reporting is that, are you just talking about the look of it? Because the true structured reporting really happens on the back-end side, right? Like, so that I can actually data mine and I can connect to other, machine readable format, connect with another API, another system, they can communicate each other. That's not going to happen just because you just tap to use a structured template, right? Because that's just more superficial. Like, because a lot of times that becomes a completely flat file when it goes over to a secondary system, right? And so the LLMs really have the also ability to really keep that in the structure, truly structured format, like a JSON in the backend. And then, so I think there's a lot of, opportunities from that. And, one of the things areas that people don't really talk about are things like graph neural networks and, knowledge graphs. But that's another area that like you can really leverage if the LLMs can truly structure the report content. So I see a lot of potential, but that is a long way of saying, yes, there's a lot of potential for using LLMs to create true structured report or structured data. Yes.
I'm going to pivot a bit to a different area where, a couple years ago, Dr. Judy Gachoya had led a paper out of Emory that was about, they de-anonymized a number of studies, and to a high degree of accuracy could identify the race of the patient. And they even took away the BMI, and still to a high degree, you could identify the race of the patient. So the paper was geared around the opportunity that AI could perpetuate racial bias and so on. And I wanted to touch on what your thoughts are on that specifically, and also just equity and fairness and how we can have trust that these models are making decisions that are in accordance with ethical, principles that we want to see.
Yeah, great question. So I like to tackle that question by talking about two different things. I love that paper by Judy, by the way. I reference it, I mention it all the time, and for different reasons. So the first thing I will talk about is related to this whole demographic data. And this is a critical issue because if you get the demographic data wrong at the start, it ripples through everything. For example, healthcare AI models that underestimate Black patients' health needs, we've seen those things. And when you look at the AI literature, it's very clear that the quality of data matters. And this goes beyond just demographic data. And so when you look at the AI model details that are publicly available, unfortunately, you often find that such information is missing. And I can tell you, if you look at the details, they won't tell you anything about demographics or how the model performed in their test setting in a sub-demographic fashion, right? They just give you one metric, like sensitivity, specificity over the entire data set, but they don't tell you like how model actually performs from a demographic perspective. And the thing is that I think a lot of this also you realize is that, a lot of this computer vision models are also trained on DICOM data sets that rely on DICOM headers. And these headers have like oftentimes, missing or worse, incorrect data. And believe me, I've seen this firsthand many, many times. And it leads to classic garbage in, garbage out. Still, it's not just a tech company problem. We really need everyone at the table. Yes, the tech companies have to take the lead on implementing better practices, but we also need regulators, setting standards, and academic institutions developing new methodology for better evaluations. And most importantly, we need the actual communities affected by these systems to be involved in how their data gets collected and used. And so I would say this has to be a collaborative effort. Now, the second point about Judy's paper that I tend to focus on is in terms of using generative AI for synthetic data. So I like that particular paper because the takeaway that I got was, okay, if the AI model can tell the race of the patient by looking at an X-ray, that no other radiologist that If you show me a hand X-ray, I can tell you. It's a guess. And yet they know something. They are seeing something we cannot in these images. So my question is, when you start training AI models to create synthetic data, just to augment that lung lesion or the liver tumor, that because you don't have enough cases of it, so you start synthetically generating. My question is, what other things are you synthetically generating that you cannot see yourself? And that could include demographic bias. So for example, one of the papers from folks from Mayo Clinic, what they showed was that, when they trained these AI models to synthetically generate pelvic x-rays, just to see, what would the AI model thinks there are differences from a black patient versus a white patient. And what they found was that these AI models were generating these x-rays with hip osteoarthritis that are much worse for black patients than white patients. So imagine taking that as a synthetic data set and training your future AI model. But the thing is, there's nothing about black patients versus white patients. It's not a racial thing in terms of how severe your osteoarthritis gets. It's more of a socioeconomic determinant that led to that type of data set in the training set, right? So those are the things, the bias and these things that are seeping into it. So when you are synthetically generating data, which I do see a lot of potential for synthetic data, but I think the thing that we have to worry about is, like, I know you're trying to synthetically create for ABC. My question is, what XYZ that you don't know about or you don't see or you haven't even thought about that these models are creating, and then you're training your future models on top of them. And so that's my thought was, that's the thing that I mentioned in my editorial last year in Radiology, Seeing the Unseen, is like, hey, we really have to try to figure out to see the unseen. Like, maybe we'll never figure out how to determine and figure out how the model is determining the race of the patient by looking at an X-ray, but we really should try to figure out. And we really have to be careful about how to use these tools and think about the downstream consequences of those unseen consequences. And we have to be more thoughtful about it. That's it.
That's an incredible point. It's funny, when I read the paper, another area that I started thinking is, imaging is very downstream to patient identity. That's managed at the EMR, but we feel the consequence of it when it doesn't work. And when, if an EMPI doesn't register properly and now you have a broken record. And so if a model with all the demographic data stripped out could identify the race, I feel like there's a very close proximity where you could get to a fingerprint of a patient, and you could identify to a high degree of accuracy that, yes, this is Jason based on the history, and you would also have the metadata. Again, we are downstream to patient identity, but when things break, and especially in Canada, we work in a very regional way where hospitals feed into these regional provincial imaging centers. A tool like that would be very useful down the road.
So since you mentioned the fingerprint, I'll share two additional things that I read recently. One is that there was a research paper that showed that AI models can easily identify where that image came from, which hospital it came from. And it's something that we've known for actually over a decade, that, CNNs are pretty good at that, actually. Identifying the data set, like where did this image come from? If randomly shuffling it showed to the AI, there's, oh yeah, that came from Mimic, data set. It knows how to do that. And the thing is, though, what they did was they tried to strip away everything. Like maybe it was the kind of the markers that they use at this hospital in that corner of that X-ray. So they put black patches, and then they try to strip away different things and make it into the same pixels, and normalize through the Z-axis so that you account for the brightness differences, and even come down to just showing the contour of the heart and lungs, and it still was able to do it, right? It wasn't until you completely randomly mix the pixels, then it started start to fail, but the performance superhuman. And so these data sets also have fingerprints. And so the question is okay, when that happens, because you do know that AI models take shortcuts. Whenever you give them a shortcut, it will identify it. And once it identifies that shortcut, it will leverage that, right? So you have to think is it really learning or is it taking a shortcut? You don't know, right? And so that's one aspect of the fingerprint that you have to think about when it comes to, these things. And as far as, the patient identification thing you mentioned, just I think a couple of days ago, Dr. Eric Topo, posted on X about like how there was a Nature paper that showed when you ask these AI models to synthetically create images, sometimes it would just literally spit out what it actually saw before. So it's an actual you are actually showing
Photocopy.
the patient's chest X-ray. Like it didn't make up based on your chest X-ray. It literally shows your chest X-ray as a synthetic data, and that's identifiable, right? So these are some of the challenges and questions I think we really, really have to think about. And so one of the things that I always talk about AI solutions and things that obviously I have certain personal opinions, and not everybody would agree to that. But one of the things that I always say is I'm not a personal huge fan of like testing LLMs with multiple choice questions.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I always, comment on that. But the reason I have issues with that isn't so much about the MCQ aspect of it, although the fact that my PACS monitors don't give me a, multiple choice option whenever I open up the case. But it's really kind of moving away from figuring out like, how does this model work? Like, I want folks to even folks within radiology research world, not just the hardcore AI engineer, developers, the researchers from these large labs, but even within radiology AI world, I want to challenge the folks to say, you know what, let's look under the hood and see how this thing actually works. Rather than I'm giving a question, it got the correct answer. Yay, that's great. Put a bunch of statistics around it. I'm personally not a huge fan of that. I rather figure out why did it get that wrong? And why did it not get it right when I started shuffling the answer choices, or I changed one word from this to this, and those kinds of things. I'd rather people try to really figure out so that I can understand this is how it works, this is how it fails, and when it fails, so that when I do use it, that I'm cognizant and I'm aware of it, and be cautious about it.
I'm curious what your thoughts are. I recently read the book Nexus, which is the same author that wrote Sapiens, just talking about the evolution of information and how humans have grown, and from oral history to writing on rocks to where we are today with AI. And one of the interesting components was about agentic AI. And we have when agents start talking to agents, and the cookie crumble of how it came to its decision gets even harder for us to be able to find. I'm curious if you have thoughts around combating that challenge.
Yeah. So I think recently there were a group of, prominent AI thought leaders and experts came together and said, we really need to put greater emphasis on figuring out that thinking process, making that it remains transparent. Because a couple things are happening. One is that even though in that particular paper, they really wanted to emphasize this whole chain of thought, process, like it needs to be visible. But there are a bunch of papers recently that have shown that when the AI model actually exposes this quote unquote chain of thought or thinking process, what it actually does and what it says is thinking about are different. And so that's not a true reflection of what the AI is actually doing. Is what some of these papers are showing, that chain of thought, that all that stuff is just, there's a lot of, weakness and flaws to that. And you can't even say because AI came to this decision because it went through step A, B, C, when it actually went through, A, D, then, E, and then back to C, and, whatever. That's what's happening in the back end. But they realize you know what? I'm not saying I don't want to, obviously make it into humans, but it's, let's just say it's not a true reflection. Even if you see their thinking process, output it, what is actually doing in the back end. But I think the reason why these folks are alarmed and want to make sure that we at least keep that and then make that even improve on that is because these AI agents are now getting to a point where potentially they can create their own language because they may find the way humans communicate with English might be very inefficient. And so there are also stories out there where AI agents, after a while, talking to each other, create their own language that no one could understand. And that would be a real problem. Either they show something, their thinking process, quote unquote, and I like the word, put the word thinking in the quotes, but that process, even if they expose it, we have to, make sure that it is exactly what's happening, that it's a true transparency. So that's important. But the thing is either that goes away Or because they're like, you know what? I mean, like, why do I need to, spend all these tokens showing the human what I'm doing and, slowing me down? I can do this much faster without it. Or coming up with an entirely different way of communications, like a different language that we don't understand, that will be a problem. So I would say yes, it is something that we should think about, and it is a serious issue. And I can see why some people are raising alarm bells.
Human language, it's a lossy compression format, right? So
Yeah,
it's not optimal all the time. I wanted to give you an opportunity just to kind of close out, and maybe, we talked about AlexNet in 2012. Here we are in 2025. Predictions are really hard to make, but where do you see the future going as far as the AI and imaging and the role of the radiologist in the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, you know what? People who know me know that, I hate making predictions because people are gonna come eventually, 5 years from now, they're gonna watch this video and say, hey, Woojin said this, he was totally off, 5 out of 6 things he said. Not that I care too much, but like I also don't, necessarily need that distraction. But what I would say, however, isn't so much about trying to predict. I do predictions in the sense that I like to see the trends, because when I see the trends, I can kind of see where things are moving. And so one of the things that I am watching, obviously, is I've seen the trends going from LLMs to large multimodal models, and then it's going towards, agentic AI. And so I think in radiology, you're going to see a greater use of large multimodal models, such as, one of the things we didn't really talk about was like automated draft report generation. That's one of the hot topics, both in terms of archive paper, non-radiologists, researchers focusing on, give it a chest x-ray, create a, full radiology report. And it's also something that both the researchers within radiology space as well as the industry are also looking into. So I do see that maturing, and we will start to see some more products along that line, potentially commercially as well in the very near future. Definitely there's, we've seen the potential from a paper perspective. And there was a Northwestern paper I think you may have seen that, they use this generative AI solution internally to generate automatic generated report, draft reporting. And they show, I think, 15.5%, productivity gain, efficiency gain with that. So I think you were going to see some of that. And the next trend is agentic AI. So that's the other thing when I see it, I think that's definitely going to come into radiology, right? And granted, no disrespect to my other industry colleagues, but I think you will see a lot of agentic AI being mentioned at RSNA this year. One of the things that we really have to be careful is it truly agentic AI or AI agents, or is it just AI workflow? Mm-hmm. That differentiation is a huge deal, other than like, I do think, you do need to leverage both of them. But from a marketing perspective, you really want to make sure that, they're using those terms correctly. But that is another thing that I can see coming into the radiology in the next 5 to 10 years, where you're going to see our field leveraging more on the agentic AI combined with the multimodal models and these foundation models. So I think we're going to definitely see that. And it's not so much of a prediction. It's just literally just watching the field. Dr. Paul Cheng used to always say, like, if you want to look really, really smart, just look at what everybody else is doing and bring that over to radiology, because we're 15, 20 years behind everybody. You're going to look like a genius. And he coined that term, intellectual arbitrage. And that's the thing that I've been doing from, industry perspective all my life, from, my startup career. And so I do take value in that, except now it's probably not 15, 20 years. Things are moving very, very quickly. And so I just have to look at what's happening outside of radiology, and I can kind of guess what's going to come in radiology. So that's the kind of trend I would see. And that's what I would see in the next 5 to 10 years, if not shorter. But from a more practical perspective, like, so what do I do now? That's like 5, 10 years from now. And so lately, what I've been telling people often is that, because people ask me, like, what do I do now? And I say, learn about AI. And just like I said at the beginning of this talk, not just reading about it. And you don't have to know every, transformer architecture out there. You don't need to do that. But you do need to have a basic understanding of AI, but also play with the tools. And so I strongly recommend that, number one, and especially for the younger generation that are constantly battling this, debate, like, should I even go into radiology, is to learn and learn to think critically, because at the end of the day, that's going to become very important It's important today. It's going to be important even when we start using AI. And so that would be some of the recommendations I would give.
So you're saying that if someone wants to learn, they don't have to necessarily read 4 to 6 hours of studies a day. I really enjoyed this, Woojin. Thank you very much for your time today. And I'll see you at RSNA in November.
Sounds good.
The dream machine. .com, HO7, IHE, and Snap. We're building the future, never looking back.